Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the third of 7 Towards Stockholm+50 Legacy Webinars, Environmental Rights, Human Rights, and Environmental Justice. The theme of this webinar is the web of life and rights, the legacy of the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. The event has been organized by Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future in collaboration with ForUM Norway, the civil society unit at the United Nations Environment Program in Nairobi, and with the support of the government of Sweden, the host country of Stockholm+50. I'm Charles Newhan, chairman of Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future, and your host today from New York. I'm joined by our keynote presenter, Professor Daniel Magraw, and Stakeholder Forum Senior Advisor Leida Rijnhout, who joins us from Antwerp in Belgium. For those of you unfamiliar with Stakeholder Forum, it is an international, not-for-profit NGO that has, for more than 25 years, been working to advance sustainable development at all levels. Stakeholder Forum seeks to provide a bridge between those who have a stake in sustainable development and the international forums where decisions are made in their name. Now, a bit of housekeeping. Before we get properly started, I'd like you to know that the webinar is being recorded, and a link to that recording and a copy of the presentations and the webinar chat will be posted on the Towards Stockholm website soon after. The event is also being live streamed on YouTube. We've had over 300 people register with us for this event, so we're hoping for a large turnout. Now, as you will see, in regards to the attendees, cameras and microphones are muted and will remain that way throughout the webinar. If there is time towards the end to bring in members of the audience in an interactive way, we will certainly endeavor to do that, but that depends on how much time we have towards the end. There will be 2 primary sessions, each followed by a question and answer period, and then a discussion on forward-looking recommendations. If we do not need all of the time for questions, we'll move on to the following session. Please note that questions should be submitted in the Q&A window, not the chat window. We'll keep an eye on the chat window and remind you to put questions in the Q&A window. It would be easier for us to do that. Also, you'll be able to scroll through the questions and upvote questions. So that is, you'll be able to vote for a question that's already asked if you too would like it to be addressed. That will help us select the questions that speakers can answer within the time we have. Apologies in advance for not being able to answer all the questions due to time constraints. Now let me introduce our presenters. Daniel Magraw is an international lawyer with experience in international law, institutions, processes, and policies, particularly relating to the environmental protection, dispute settlement, investment, and human rights, including climate change and environmental justice. He is a professor, lecturer, and senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, and President Emeritus of the Center for International Environmental Law. Professor Magraw has worked in government, non-government organizations, intergovernmental organizations, businesses, and academia, including as a consultant to the United Nations regarding the environment, human rights, and investment. Also, he's authored many books, lectured widely, and taught at the universities of California, Berkeley, Colorado, Miami, and at the Georgetown University Law Center. Leida Rijnhout has been a key advisor to Stakeholder Forum for many years, where she recently led its work relating to strengthening environmental governance and law, including human rights. Before joining the SF team, she worked as an independent consultant. In her position as Executive Director of AMPED and Director of Global Policies and Sustainability at the European Environmental Bureau, Leida facilitated and coordinated the global NGO community to realize their active engagement in United Nations processes on sustainable development and the environment. From May 2022, Leida will be the Chief Executive of the World Fair Trade Organization, the WFTO. We also have an exceptional panel of experts with us, recruited by Daniel Magraw to add further depth to today's proceedings. Diane Dillon Ridgely is an environmentalist and human rights activist who has, for some 40 years, been at the forefront of society's shift from an industrial one to one focused on sustainability. Appointed by 3 U.S. presidents across 3 administrations, she has served on 23 U.S. delegations at the UN and other global meetings. By appointment to the White House, She attended the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, the 1997 General Assembly Special Session to review the implementation of Agenda 21, and the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development in South Africa, making her the only person to serve on all 3 US delegations. Dr. Bruce A. Byers is an ecologist, independent consultant, and writer. His career has focused on understanding and improving the long-term resilience of social ecological systems, healing the human-nature relationship, and especially the role of biological diversity and functioning ecosystems in that resilience. Bruce has worked in more than 40 countries around the world and in 35 UNESCO-designated biosphere reserves. His book, The View from Cascade Head, Lessons from the Biosphere from the Oregon Coast, published by the Oregon State University Press in 2020, profiled the Cascade Head Biosphere Reserve. He is currently working on a book about California's two UNESCO biosphere reserves, the Golden Gate and Channel Islands Biosphere Reserves. Silvio Ribeiro is the Latin American director of the Action Group on Erosion Technology and Concentration, the ETC group based in Mexico. She is a researcher, writer, and educator on the impacts of emerging technologies on society and particularly on vulnerable and marginalized people. While at the ETC group, Sylvia has participated in the negotiations of several UN treaties on the environment, climate, biodiversity, and food. She has critically followed the debate and developments of geoengineering and its actors for well over a decade. And finally, we have Li Lin, who is a research fellow with the International Justice Initiative at Johns Hopkins, a second-year energy resource and environment concentrator with a specialization in infrastructure finance at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Before SAIS, Li studied English literature at Shanghai International Studies University in China. Now, a little bit more about background before we hand things over to Dan. In preparation for Stockholm+50, Dan and his colleague Li Lin are preparing a paper that will be part of this legacy project, one of 7 reports that will be combined in the publication of the People's Environment Narrative. The chapter on environmental rights, human rights, and environmental justice is based on the knowledge that the Stockholm Conference's legacy has extended 50 years already and will continue. In 1972, we did not know what environment and rights issues would arise. The same is true now regarding the next 50 years. The challenge is how to imagine and illuminate that future. Daniel and Lee have approached this challenge by asking 40 thinkers to write short essays on environment and right issues they think are likely to be important in the future. Most of those essays are now in hand and are referred to as the imagining essays. Daniel and Lee's chapter will have 3 parts. The first will describe the Stockholm Conference's legacy to now. The second part will imagine the future using the essays I've just mentioned. And the third part will reflect on the future as illuminated by those essays. Today, Daniel will begin by addressing one of the most important and radical, but also common sense legacies of the Stockholm Declaration, the right to a healthy environment. Following that will be a panel discussion moderated by Leida, where Lee will share a summary of the common themes and main points in the imagining essays. Silvio Ribeiro will discuss climate change and geoengineering. Diane will share her thoughts on environmental justice, and Bruce will discuss humankind's relationship to nature. Daniel will conclude that panel with some comments for UNEP, civil society, and other stakeholders. Please welcome Daniel, Leida, and our special guest. Daniel will deliver the first session. Dan, I'm now going to hand over to you. I have a slide up for you, and let us go back to you.
Thank you very much, Charles. And I can't see all of the participants online, but thank you all for joining us this morning. It's a very exciting set of issues. As you can see and already heard, I'm going to be talking about the right to a healthy environment, which is a major part of what we refer to as the web of life and rights. And I'm going to see if I can control these slides. Okay. And so far that's not working.
I'm going to stop sharing, Dan, and I'll let you now share your screen.
Oh, okay. Am I sharing my screen then? Yeah. That work for everyone? Can you see that, Charles? I can't hear any response.
I don't see your.
No, it's not there.
Shared screen yet.
All right, well, then let's go back to your screen and I'll just have to ask you to move the slides, I'm afraid.
Sure. That's fine. Just say next and I'll move them forward. Are we seeing it now, folks?
Yeah, I see it. Thank you. So if you'd move to the next slide. It's good to start at the beginning here. And if we think about when human rights really began, which was right after World War II with the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you see that there's no word environment in this word cloud. And as I'm sure everyone on this call appreciates, that's quite understandable. There was no environmental consciousness in 1948 to speak of, and it simply wasn't on people's radar screens. One thing that's very nice is that the Human Rights Declaration talks about everyone, and including children there you can see hidden in the first E. Next slide, please. The Stockholm Declaration, Principle 1, has, as Charles said, something that's a pretty radical statement for that time. Man, and you can see we've actually gone retrograde on that. It doesn't say everyone, but it means everyone. Man has the fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment of equality that permits a life of dignity and well-being. And so here is really the first statement in an internationally agreed instrument of the right to a healthy environment. And this is a major legacy of the Stockholm Conference. Next slide, please. 20 years later at Rio, the statement was somewhat different. And I think many of the essays that we've received so far, and I imagine many that still come in, talk about the need to reset the relationship of human to nature. And actually, this reflects that. Human beings are at the center of concerns for sustainable development. They are entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature. Entitles is rights language, but the harmony with nature part is really new. That didn't appear as explicitly in the Stockholm Declaration, and it's an important addition. Next slide, please. One thing we've learned since 1992 even, has to do with the concept of ecosystem services. And again, I'll assume that most of you on this call know this idea. It's an extraordinarily important idea. I'm using the breakdown here, the 4-part breakdown that UNEP used in a 2000 publication. It talks about provisioning ecosystem services. And ecosystem services, just to remind you, are what nature provides us for free. We may have to do a little work to get them, these services, but nature has them for us if we don't screw it up. And so provisioning includes water, fiber, food, fuel, clean air, these sorts of things that nature gives us for free. Regulating includes the ozone layers filtering out of ultraviolet radiation that will cause cancer to us and destroy the food, the basis of the food system in the oceans if we don't take care of it. Pollination occurs where the insects of the world pollinate our plants. We simply couldn't do these things or provide these services on our own. We don't have the knowledge and we don't have the resources to do that. Cultural services include aesthetics, religious, opportunities for recreation, that sort of thing. And servicing are even more basic things like the regenerating soil and that sort of thing. The point of this is, and the conclusion is, if you understand all these, that nature is the infrastructure of our society. It's not roads, it's not dams, it's nature. And our society is built on this nature. Next slide, please. In fact, this nature is now being affected by humans in major ways. And many of us refer to the Anthropocene, which is the idea that we're in a new epoch where humans are really the major force on the biosphere. And this lists different types of human effects that are not just local, but really global: anthropogenic climate change, loss of biodiversity, the toxification of the planet, deforestation, geological changes from activities like damming rivers, mining, and landscaping. New slide, please, Charles. And the point is, we're changing nature. We're maybe the biggest force in changing nature, and things are not going well. That infrastructure that we just talked about is in trouble. These are just some of the recent warnings. And again, I think most of you know most of these things, but just to go through them real quickly: pollution is causing about 9 million deaths per year. Global warming, we're at a code red at this point. There's a 60% decline in wildlife population over those 40 years. That's in North America, we have 3 billion fewer birds. And here, these are not referring to the number of species. These are referring to the number of organisms. There are 1 million species at risk of extinction. There's predicted there'll be more plastic in the ocean than fish by 2050. And there's going to be huge internal displacement from climate and other impacts, and also refugees, transboundary refugees. Now, the institutions that made these predictions are not quacks. These are composed of the best scientists that we have in the world. And of course, there's uncertainty about them, but we can be pretty sure these kinds of impacts are going to happen on this kind of scale. It could be a little worse, it could be a little better, but things are going downhill on most of these indicators. New slide, please. Having said that, there's also good news, and we have to keep this in mind, especially for young people. And just a few examples of what's happened in the United States here. Air pollution in Los Angeles and Denver is much, much, much improved from, say, the late 1960s. Pollution in the Chesapeake Bay is improving. Depletion of the ozone layer, we are dealing with that. And so they're physical examples of where we have made a real difference and continue to make a difference. On the other side of that slide is the major success story of international law and sustainable development of the past 50 years. And it's the integration of human rights and environmental protection runs right back to Principle 1 of the Stockholm Declaration. Next slide, please. So the environmentalists were very interested in integrating these two areas, environment and human rights. And the main reason for that has to do with two things, really. One is the institutional part. The human rights system, as you may know, has institutions where individuals can bring claims against countries for violation of human rights. And that, by and large, does not exist in the environmental system. So there was a tremendous tool that was possible. And the second was conceptual, especially once we realized the importance of ecosystem services. It's so obvious that you can't really have a human rights without having a healthy environment. And we all knew, and we continue to know, that we're not going to protect either human rights or the environment without a very strong civil society presence. There's just no question about that. And we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want, but it's just been really obvious. The human rights side, however, was not real enamored with this idea. And there are a number of reasons for that. One was just, why confuse human rights? It's hard enough to protect the basic human rights, right to life, rights against torture, against slavery, free expression, etc., without confusing it with this environmental stuff. And part of that was just educational, but part of it is a real concern about the political impacts as well, because there are already political, of course, opponents to human rights. And if you add to that the political opponents to dealing with the environmental problems, then it makes it more difficult. In any event, new slide, please. What we did was we tried everything we could. That was our strategy, and it was quite conscious on the parts of some of us. New slide, please, Charles. This is just some of the things we did. Articles, conferences, worked with governments, think tanks. Here are a couple of the major NGOs, but there are all sorts of them. We worked with IGOs, including UNEP and the UN Human Rights System. We worked with the regional human rights system, including by bringing cases that one by one in Africa and Europe and the Americas, the human rights institution said, yeah, of course, you kill someone with mercury, it's the same as killing them with a gun. It violates their human right to life. And it's very logical, but that was not easy to get there. And we did get there in all three of those different regional systems. We also had domestic court litigation. And of course, we worked with, as I said already, the UN human rights system, but including the special rapporteurs. New slide, please. One of the major efforts we made was to get there to be a special rapporteur, which are appointed by the Human Rights Council, on environmental issues. We started with the idea of a special rapporteur on climate change and human rights. And that was met with a lot of opposition. And we made a pivot at one point. This was mostly Mark Lehman, who was the representative of the Maldives in Geneva, and I and others. We just decided we couldn't get that, but we probably could get a special rapporteur on human rights and environment. And in the Human Rights Council, as elsewhere in the international system, one wants these things to be adopted by consensus. And that was being difficult because the United States in particular was opposed to this idea. Fortunately, the United States also wanted there to be a special rapporteur on Iran and human rights. The Muslim countries were blocking that, but Mark worked a deal where the Maldives, who he represented, and which is a member of the Islamic group, could block consensus there, but only on the basis of the U.S. supporting the special rapporteur on human rights and environment. And in fact, the U.S. ambassador to Geneva went back to D.C., worked the corridors, and the U.S. changed its position. And that's why there was a special rapporteur on human rights and environment. And this proved to be extremely important. The first rapporteur, John Knox, elaborated the conceptual relationship between human rights and environmental protection. And that's very important for the right to a human environment, to a healthy environment, because we have to really understand what the basic relationship was. And he did a mapping of different parts of the human rights system. This was an empirical exercise. And it turned out that when he looked at these different parts of the system, how they dealt with specific issues, there was a remarkable uniformity in how they dealt with things like environmental impact assessment, which none of us knew, but it turns out almost all of these parts of the system have held that, yes, there is a human rights obligation to conduct environmental impact assessments. That's just one example, but these are the notion of ecosystem services and this mapping exercise and John's work in analyzing it and explaining it are really the empirical bases that allowed the recognition of a right to a healthy environment. He also worked to protect environmental human rights defenders. I'll come back to that issue in a bit. And he explored how human rights and climate change are related. New slide, please. As almost his last official act, he also promulgated these framework principles on human rights and environment. They do not include the right to a healthy environment, but he said at the time that he thought the international community should recognize universally the right to a healthy environment. Next slide, please. So what is the state of the law? Let's just revisit that real quickly. The new slide, please. It turns out there is a interdependency between human rights and the environment. And I already alluded to it. On the one hand, a healthy environment is necessary for the enjoyment of a vast array of human rights. This comes in part from the notion of ecosystem services. You just can't, our society is based on those ecosystem services, and we can't protect human rights without it. On the other hand, that the exercise of human rights, the right to freedom of opinion, freedom of expression, or the right to peaceful assembly, the right to association, privacy, those rights are vital to the protection of the environment for the reason I already gave. So that's the basic reciprocal relationship. Next slide, please. States have procedural obligations, substantive obligations, and then they have heightened obligations to those who are most vulnerable and for indigenous peoples. Next slide. Procedurally, none of this will surprise you given what I've already said. We need to assess environmental impacts on human rights, and that's a human rights obligation. There's a right to access to information for environmental information and other information. States have to facilitate participation in environmental decision-making and those rights that I described earlier. And then there's an obligation to provide effective remedies for environmental harms. None of these are actually very surprising because they're all part of other established human rights, except that first one about environmental impact assessment. And as you may know, in the transboundary arena, the International Court of Justice about 5 years ago held that there's a customary international law obligation to conduct transboundary environmental impact assessment. So these two, you can see that there's some convergence even outside of John's work, etc. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier environmental human rights defenders, and this is a particular problem. States are failing miserably in terms of this aspect of their procedural, or if you want to call it a substantive human rights obligations. There are about four, I shouldn't say about, there are at least four environmentalists murdered on average every week around the world. And these are not abstract numbers. We know the names of these people. And there are almost no prosecutions for those murders, almost none. On two hands, you can count the number of prosecutions per year. And those don't always end in convictions either. The problem seems to be worse in Latin America and East Asia, but I think that's because we get the data from there. I think it exists in other places too, but we just don't have adequate data. In any event, it's a serious, serious problem. The most dangerous thing to be in the world is an environmentalist and to speak out. And obviously it's a problem that we need to deal with. Next slide, please. In terms of these environmental human rights defenders, we know what states need to do. They have to protect them when they're subject to threats. They have to refrain themselves from placing restrictions that would hinder the performance of their work. And then they have to conduct serious and effective investigations of any violations against them. And that's been held by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, but it all makes sense anyway, just in terms of other established human rights obligations. Next slide, please. Substantively, States have to protect against foreseeable environmental harm to human rights. They have to protect against harm from non-state actors, and that includes business entities, and that's a major, major issue. States have a discretion to strike a balance between environmental protection, social development, and economic development. This is the notion of one part of the notion of sustainable development. And I have here my soccer ball or football, for those of you who are not Americans, that has all of the sustainable development goals on them, which are related because they're all on one soccer ball. So states have discretion, but the balance can't be unreasonable or result in unjustified, foreseeable infringements of human rights. And what exactly that means depends on the human right, of course. Next slide, please. As I said, states have heightened duties to protect the most vulnerable, and who are the most vulnerable, of course, depends on the situation. Next slide, please. Now, in 2018, the Human Rights Council directed the special rapporteur, who was just changing from John Knox to the current special rapporteur, David Boyd, to report to the UN General Assembly on the human right to a healthy environment. You can see the Human Rights Council there. Next slide. This is with the background that even after Stockholm and then Rio, that the Human Rights Commission, which was the predecessor of the Human Rights Council, rejected the right to a healthy environment. So what's changed? It's good to see what's changed. Why did we think now we could succeed? First, there's increased knowledge of ecosystem services that I mentioned before, and the understanding that nature is the infrastructure of society. Second, we had the application of the relationship between human rights and environment, which included John Knox's mapping exercise. And then third, there was a massive adoption of the right to a healthy environment by states in national constitutions, national laws, or in legally binding regional human rights treaties. And at this point, there are more than 155 countries that are legally bound to respect the right to a healthy environment. They may phrase it differently, but they have it either as a result, either of their national constitutions, national legislation, or treaties. So it's something that's really been recognized. And as those of you who are in America may know, or the United States, that New York just adopted this. It exists in other states too, Montana, Missouri, Pennsylvania. These are red and blue states. So this is something that is not weird. It's not causing any problems. And in fact, it seems to be helping. New slide, please. So what is this right to a healthy environment? What would it consist of? Now, I must say, I was initially skeptical about this. It was a lack of imagination, I think, on my part. But in any event, I'm from Minnesota. And actually, the environment there, in some ways, is not healthy. You can freeze to death in the winter, people do. And there are rattlesnakes that will kill you if you get bitten in the wrong place at the wrong time, et cetera. So I took a rather formulaic view of it very early. Then I had the fortune to work on two cases. One was the Inuit case, which was the first case to allege that climate change was violating human rights. This was in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and we brought it knowing that the commission, in fact, would not try to resolve this issue. It's too big an issue for the Inter-American Commission, but to put a human face on climate change, and we succeeded in that. The situation of the Inuits essentially is that their culture and lives are being destroyed in the Arctic. The Arctic warms at twice the average speed or rate of the rest of the world. That endangers the life of the Inuit, who have to walk on the ice. The ice melts from below, so they can't tell if it's strong or not. They fall through, they die, they lose their legs, etc. Their property along the shoreline is literally falling into the ocean because there's less shore ice and therefore more erosion. They can't travel over the ice as well because the snow is changing so that it's harder for them to build igloos, which are necessary to protect them as they travel to hunt or travel between villages. I could go on. The Maldives are somewhat different, but they came to us after that Inuit case, and we worked with them to create the Malay Declaration on the human dimensions of climate change. Again, it was carrying forth that idea that there is a human side to climate change. And that was the first international instrument to really address that issue. The Maldives are a string of 1,200 islands along the southwest coast of India and Sri Lanka. It's as different an environment as you can imagine from the Inuit. They have exactly the same problem, though. They're being destroyed by climate change. The details are different. In the Maldives, the highest point, except for a golf tee, is 2 meters above sea level, and outlying islands are already uninhabitable. They've been moving people in from those. The country will disappear if we continue with business as usual and sea level rise continues at present rates. These two situations demonstrate there is a real issue here about a fundamental right to a healthy environment. It's not just the amalgamation of the rights to life and culture and property and adequate standard of living, et cetera. There's something different going on here. And in Malay, we came up with this functional definition. It's different than the words safe, healthy, clean, sustainable, but it describes what we're really talking about, which is a right to an environment capable of supporting our society and the full enjoyment of human rights. Next slide, please. So there was a tremendous international effort, a really amazing group of people working and countries working to get this adopted by the Human Rights Council. That happened on 8th October this last year. The vote was 43 yes, no votes, and 4 abstentions by important countries agreed, China, India, Japan, and Russia. But nevertheless, they did not vote against it. The United States, I think, would have, because it was so actively opposing it, and countries who are not in the council can participate in the consultations. And President Trump had withdrawn the United States from the council, as you may recall. But in any event, that was the vote. Russia destroyed consensus by requiring a vote. So we didn't get consensus. Still, that's a very, very good vote. And the US is, we're going to the General Assembly now, probably by the end of June. The US is still actively imposing it, so is Russia. But we think that it's certain to pass in the General Assembly. 100 countries officially endorsed Resolution 4813. That's more than half the countries in the General Assembly. A lot of other ones will vote for it. So we know we're going to pass. We just want a strong vote. Next slide, please. This is very legalistic, but in 1986, the General Assembly articulated five guidelines for developing instruments regarding human rights. All of these are met. And I won't run through them all. If there are any questions, of course, we can revisit it. But if you just look at number 5, attract broad international support. Well, as I said, 155 countries already have it in their own way. So this is not something that is out of the blue or unsupported. Next slide, please. So what does it add? This is really a critical thing. And first, it adds substance. As I said, it's more than just the sum of the other rights. Second of all, it clarifies the scope of states' obligations. It's a broad thing. It talks generally. It's a capstone. And we think this is really important. And I think this is an idea that will be developed over the next 50 years, that it's a capstone. It solidifies and organizes the existing law of environmental human rights and can result in a normative cascade. Now, what do we mean by that? For those of you who are biologists, you know of the idea of a trophic cascade, where a change at any point in the food chain will cause changes underneath that. It's common sense, although we can't predict these all. For example, something that Bruce Byers, I know, has lectured on and worked towards. When we introduced wolves into Yellowstone National Park, it affected the elk, which then affected the aspen groves, which the elk feed on, and which are the world's largest living organism, in fact, and protected those more. But it also ended up changing the shape of the river there. And that's something we didn't predict. But that kind of trophic cascade is similar to what we think is happening with the normative cascade, where there is a right to a healthy environment, not always by any means, not in Russia, for example. But in many countries, what we see is that the other rights are protected better underneath it, and the environment is protected better underneath it. I say underneath in terms of this cascade effect. And so it's a very important question, an important issue, and how it happens, why it happens, how we can promote its happening are things that we need, I think, to investigate. For those of you who are familiar with the UN in particular, or any bureaucracy, another thing the right to a healthy environment can do is be a hook for organizing projects and allocating resources. If you get a General Assembly statement that X matters, then you can go to parts of the UN and say, okay, let's work on X. And we did that, for example, with the 1996 agreement to remove lead from gasoline. It took 2 years, literally, to get it onto UNEP's program. The first year we tried, Mexico blocked it, but the second year we got it. And only 2 years ago did we finally finish that process, but that saved millions of lives. The point is, because of that global agreement in '96 at Istanbul, we were able to build that program. Right to a healthy environment might be a springboard for thinking about humans' relationship to nature, and I already alluded to that need, and a lot of the essays have talked about this need. And then it clarifies the content of environmental justice. It's really the unspoken assumption of environmental justice. Can we have the next slide? Environmental justice means different things, different places, but I think there are 5 components, and I think most people agree if they think about it. One is there's no disproportionate impact of environmental harm on any particular part of society, in particular a disadvantaged part. Second, equal access to environmental amenities, such as, whoops, there's a typo there, I apologize, clean drinking water, parks. Third, safe and meaningful opportunity to participate. Fourth, access to remedies, we already talked about that. And fifth is a safe, clean, and healthy, sustainable environment. That is the right to a healthy environment. If you don't have that, you could have all those other things, but you wouldn't have justice, right? If the environment is poisoning us. So I think this can be very important in terms of articulating, conceptualizing, and realizing environmental justice as well. Next slide. Just point out that we were able to get human rights and notions of environmental justice, the just transition there in the first paragraph, into the preamble of the Paris Agreement on climate change. We worked very hard to try to get it into the operative, both of these ideas into the operative paragraphs as well, but we were not successful in that. They are in the preamble, and they're the first, this is the first international agreement, environmental agreement, where you see these concepts. Next slide, please. There's still outstanding issues. One, of course, is the General Assembly, as I just mentioned, and the right to a healthy environment there. There are questions about transboundary extraterritorial obligations that are really important. Business and human rights, it's an unfinished set of obligations in my view, and then rights of nature, which we've already referred to. Next slide. So if there's time, we can do Q&A. I didn't actually time this, so I don't know where we are. But how do you want to do this, Charles?
Dan, yeah, you were a little bit over, but that's absolutely fine. What I would say is, why don't we, if we want to bring in, I'll set us up the gallery view. If any of the other panelists would like to activate their cameras for now, in case you want to jump in. Leida, are you going to moderate the questions? Is that the plan? Okay.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you so much, Daniel, for having this quite good overview on what we have and also on things that we still don't have. There are several questions, but there are some that are overlapping. So, and I had a question as well, but that is also overlapping. So, as you showed in your presentation, there is a lot of international law, but we don't see it everywhere enforced or implemented. So the question is if there is any international compliance mechanisms to make states indeed achieve and respect those things that they have to do. I mean, their obligations. You had a list of obligations, but on many states are not doing those things. I mean, not all of those things. So, and I want to add there, because within the UNEP at 50 outcome document, there is a request towards UNEP to really start developing compliance mechanisms or review mechanisms for member states to see how many progress they make or not make towards environmental policies, and in this case, environmental law. Do you have any ideas about that? How could we, as also for civil society and other non-stakeholders, help UNEP to do this?
The question raises an important issue across the whole international legal system, of course. And the nice thing about the human rights system is at least we have institutions to make determinations, to make holdings. Countries don't always follow those. Brazil did not follow one in the Western Hemisphere. Turkey has not followed several in the European system. So it's far from a perfect system. My own feeling is that the standard things we've done as civil society continue to be at least as important in this regard. We have to keep pressuring governments. We have to keep educating citizenry, and we keep trying to keep strengthening institutions. That's not a very satisfying answer in a way, but I think that's what we need to keep doing. In terms of UNEP itself, we certainly can try to promote the kind of analytic work that the UNEP at 50 exhortation includes. We can find out what is happening and publicize that. The reason I paused is, I mean, it's clear that Russia is violating international law with its invasion of Ukraine. And so far, we don't have any institutional response to that that is really satisfactory. And those sorts of things happen. And the key, I think, is not to lose faith, but to keep fighting.
Yeah, but I think destroying the environment is often, of course, also a structural thing, which is not once it happens once in a while, but it's continuously. So I think it's really good to have this kind of mechanisms that civil society organizations can indeed go to courts that are able to manage this kind of environmental conflicts as well. Another question was about ecocides. So what is your view for the momentum that is built in the recognition, or at least the recognition of a definition of ecocide as a crime against humanity under the Rome Statutes? Do you think that makes a big difference if that would be the case, if it would be recognized and accepted?
I think it would make a difference, because it would reflect the fact that states have agreed to make it a difference. Marcos Oriana and I tried to do this in the 2000s. Marcos is now the special rapporteur on human rights and toxic substances, but at that point he worked for the Center for International Environmental Law, where I also worked. We tried to get this to happen then, it simply didn't happen. And the notion had come up much earlier than that. Marcos and I did not invent it. I think if there is real momentum, I think that's good. It in part reflects an understanding of how important the environment is. There used to be a statement or a feeling in various ministries of foreign affairs that real men don't do environment. They do war, they do finance, they do those things that are really important. I think that is changing. And if states were actually to recognize ecocide as an international crime, that would reflect an understanding that, boy, we're messing with the basis of our society. What we're doing is actually very, very important, and we have to protect it. So I think it would make a difference. I don't know that the momentum is there at the state level as opposed to among academics and civil society more generally.
Yeah. Then one last question here. There are more questions, but I think maybe they come back when we have the discussion with the whole panel. But those, I think, are more general ones, which fits quite good with your presentation. Do you think that the right for a healthy environment would also help facilitate enforcement? Because there is a lot of concern in the chat box on the enforcement. And do you think that recognition, the right of a healthy environment, would make a difference, so that also domestic courts should be involved as well?
Yes, I do. It depends on the country, of course. And, the danger of asking a lawyer anything is you're going to get an "it depends." But, there are 200 roughly different legal systems around the world. And even some of those, like the United States, have subparts that are different. So each one will view domestically, will view the right to a healthy environment in its own way. And in some countries, constitutional rights are not really justiciable. In other countries, they are. In some countries, international law, like the Netherlands, where you're from, Leida, where you live, take international law right into their jurisprudence. Whereas in the United States, it's a much more complicated process and question. So it depends very much. But yes, I think it would make a difference. And it's a matter of educating judges and that sort of thing. Antonio Benjamin couldn't be with us today, but he and UNEP have led an effort to train judges about this. And judges initially, by the way, they hated the word train, but now they're quite happy with it because yeah, we didn't know about the environment. This is great what you're doing. So I think each of these steps makes a difference. This one is a little different. We have changed the pantheon of human rights. That's a big statement. It's already happened, actually. Will it make a difference if the General Assembly goes further and not goes further, but also recognizes it? So it's not just the Human Rights Council? Yeah, it's better to have the General Assembly do it for the reason I mentioned earlier. But it's already changed. So yeah, I think, as people think about this, it will affect their thinking, including judges. Okay, thank you. That's at least sounds hopeful. I think we can go to the directly to the panel. I mean, we have, and they were introduced quite properly by Charles already, so I'm not going to do that. So we have a panel of 4 speakers, which is mostly about imagining the future. And the first speaker is Lee Lin, and she will be followed by Sylvia Ribeiro, and then Diane, Dylan, and Bruce. So what we do is we have the 4 speakers in row. We will listen to them. They all have, they know how many minutes they have. That's all prepared. And then I will go directly to Daniel Magraw, because we would like to have some recommendations also for the future, and also for the people's environmental narrative. That will be one of the outcomes of this program. So please, Lee, you can have your intervention. I know that you don't have a PowerPoint, so you can just open your video. There you are. And then the others can close their videos, including me. So you have the floor. Please go ahead, Lee.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My task today is to summarize some of the common themes and major points from the essays received so far. My comments are tentative, as we haven't received all the essays yet. First and foremost, and Stan has already discussed, the UN General Assembly should follow the lead of the UN Human Rights Council in recognizing the human rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. The Council's recognition of the right to a healthy environment transformed the pantheon of human rights. General Assembly recognition will add strength to that right. through a normative cascade akin to a trophic cascade, we can use these rights to develop ideas, plans, and actions in different contexts, countries, and society to strengthen both human rights and environmental protection efforts. Several authors mentioned that humans should reset our relationship with nature, meaning a shift away from systematic human supremacism to an ecocentric way of thinking. Bruce Byers will address aspects of this later this morning. The basic truth of Anthropocene is that humans are doing harms to the integrity and resilience of the planet with destructive forces that vastly outweighs all the others. Nature is begging for a seat at this conference. The situation raises many questions. If nature or components of nature are to have rights, what are the sources and substance of those rights? How can those rights be conceptualized, articulated, and implemented? And how do they relate to human rights? Our understanding of nature and environment governance need to be enriched. Nature is forever dynamic. The forces of nature are constantly rearranging the details of the biosphere. Studies have been narrowly focused on fauna and flora. Seldom do we think about fungi, yet we're unthinkable without them. That needs to be rectified. There are specific issues our author identified as likely to continue and need to be addressed with urgency, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, toxification of the planet, water and food scarcity, and overfishing in the ocean. And of course, there are others that we do not know about yet. It is critical that we continually monitor human health and environment, curb misinformation and disinformation, and keep solving our unrelenting ecological conundrum on the basis of science and environmental education at all levels. Individuals and communities should have equal and meaningful opportunity to participate. On average, 4 environmental human rights defenders are murdered every week around the globe. This must be addressed. Information and communication technologies and the metaverse creates opportunities for civil society interaction and involvement and the possibility of engaging art and entertainment in pursuit of a healthy environment. But they also raise the possibility of serious risks to human rights and environmental protection. Young people are at risk of becoming increasingly separated from the natural world. The power of art and entertainment should be engaged to counter this and to affirmatively build agency regarding the environment and human rights. Moreover, countries are manipulating access to the internet and content of the information, thus violating a vast range of human rights and interfering with environmental advocacy. In addition to ensuring basic rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly are respected, new rights of connectivity and net neutrality should be considered. The right to freedom of opinion must be protected because a dominant advertising-based business model for tech giants determines the way they feed materials to their customers, which unduly manipulates opinions. The surveillance economy has deeply undercut our rights to privacy, which must be remedied. There should be increased transparency, traceability, and enhanced enforcement for governments, businesses, and intergovernmental organizations. As part of that, effective citizen-based accountability mechanism should be instituted for international finance activities, including those by multilateral development banks, private finance institutions, foundations, and sovereign wealth funds. More generally, business entities' responsibility for human rights should be hardened for auditory under the guiding principles to mandatory. Businesses, particularly transnational businesses, have tremendous environmental and human rights impacts, and governments have thus far proven unable or unwilling to govern them. Businesses' ESG commitments should be subject to transparency and accountability to prevent greenwashing and obstruction in dealing with environmental and human rights problems. In terms of decision-making, environmental and human rights expertise should be integrated with other fields to ensure that economic and social decisions are well-funded. Science should be better integrated with policy and law, along with resuscitation of believing facts and verifiable truths. We need a new scientific diplomacy. We must also start and be engaged in robust intergenerational dialogue for the future of our youth and our own. No individuals or communities, especially marginalized ones, should suffer disproportionate impact from environmental harm, as Diane Dillon rigidly will discuss. Unfortunately, that has not been the case for Indigenous people who are denied the right to existence and self-development. That has not been the case for a community of color when it comes to the incineration of plastic waste. It has not been the case for the coastal communities under the negative influence of IUU fishing and pollution in the ocean, and it sure is not the case for 400 million workers who are injured or died every year due to hazardous chemical exposure and other occupational dangers. Gender issues also need to be monitored and remedied when problems arise. Similarly, the possibility that geoengineering will be used to combat climate change raises a host of possible risks, including to food security and to environmental justice. Sylvia Ribeiro will address this later. Serious issues of inequality appear throughout today's world, both within countries and among countries. Disasters are an indicator of developmental and environmental failures. The world needs leadership in pursuit and defense of preventative actions. Efforts to institutionalize environmental peacemaking are necessary, as evidenced by environmental and other havocs now being inflicted on Ukraine. On a related matter, border walls leads to human rights violations and environmental harm. Unfortunately, border wars are becoming much more common around the world, a growing problem that needs to be confronted. The international community should work together more to build peace, not walls against each other. It will probably take decades and perhaps centuries for the aforementioned issues to be worked out, or perhaps it is a never-ending process. After all, the price of a healthy planet is eternal vigilance. In the 50 years since the original Stockholm Convention, we must acknowledge that we have not solved all the environmental and human rights problems, but we must also know that we have made a difference. The world is better than it would have been. All of these ideas and arts and efforts are part of that process, and I'm truly thankful and proud to be on this journey with all of you. Godspeed.
Thank you so much, Lilin. As I said, we go directly to the second speaker, which is Sylvia Ribeiro. So please, you have the floor.
Hi, everybody. I will see if I can share my presentation. Thank you very much. Well, I will start to thank really the Stakeholder Forum for organizing this series of webinars and really interesting presentations that I already heard. So I will be speaking a few minutes on two big issues. One is climate change, which is one of the main problems we have on Earth today, together, as Lynn was saying, with other very significant climate crisis, environmental crisis. And the other one is on geoengineering. And geoengineering is a set of proposals that are technological, that are to be done at very large scale to manipulate Earth systems in an attempt to diminish in some way the effects of climate change. We could say it is a technological fix for climate change. And there are around, at this moment, there are around like 30 different proposals of this grand scale, and they are proposing to intervene on land, on ocean, and on air. And those proposing this technology usually divide them in two sets. One is to remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it somewhere that is not solved, where. And the other is to have some kind of blocking part of the radiation from the sun. So theoretically, it could have a cooling effect on Earth. So what we can see is that none of the technologies proposed aim to address the causes of climate change. They just try to do something about some of the symptoms of climate change. And that means that the drivers of climate change would continue. Those technologies comes with very large environmental, social, political, and economic risks of different kinds. Some of them are common from all of them. But none of the proposed technologies, and this is very important for us to realize, really has proven to function to address climate change. Some has some kind of pilot or very small scale, but none of them have really proved to be effective to address climate change. And there is a very, very, very big question mark to the point to make it unfeasible about the being feasible to scale at the scale required to really influence climate change. For instance, the carbon capture and storage, which has been existing for decades because this was invented by oil industry to pump more oil. That was the origin of carbon capture and storage facilities. And today only exist at micro scale. We have around 25, 27 facilities that are functioning in some scale. And theoretically, we would need 10,000 to really have an effect on climate change. But it is worse even because of these very few that are existing, 80% is to pump more oil in enhanced oil recovery. So this will increase emissions. So when we can ask ourselves, well, so why is geoengineering dangerous? Well, one thing is what I just mentioned. It is that it is giving the illusion to many governments and even many people in the world that there is a technological fix that is possible to apply. And the only one that is really developed, like I mentioned, the carbon capture and storage, is really under development and not proven. And it's very energy demanding. It has a lot of other problems. There is not enough scale and even enough places in the world to store so much carbon. So that's one problem, which is that this may not function at all. But there is also a problem about the mega scale, because nobody can say what will happen with a mega scale. And if we don't have a mega scale, it won't influence climate. Because of that, all the proposals that are proposed are really very high risk, and they are unreliable. We really don't know them. They are non-testable in the sense that they are non-experimental phase. We cannot do a small experiment and think that that will function at large scale. And to really see if it can influence climate, it should be deployed at such a scale in time and geographically and in reality that it will be already a deployment with all the possible impacts. It's clear even for those proposing technologies that this will have very unequal impacts. So some countries will benefit and others will suffer a lot, some regions. And that means that those controlling the technology may choose to apply them, but others will suffer. And of course, this is like still this technological possibility is a perfect excuse to avoid making the necessary reductions of greenhouse gases, which is the only way we really need to emphasize all the time to stop climate change at some point. So not doing that and instead relying on non-existent and risky technologies is a big intergenerational injustice, because we are living for coming generations to confront climate change and also confront the impacts of these new high-risk technologies. And all this imply a lot of human rights violations in the future, but also now. For instance, many or almost all of the experiments that are proposed on many of these very experimental technologies on solar geoengineering, they are done or proposed to be done in indigenous territories without even consulting them. So this is a very basic kind of, but there are many other human rights violations to a healthy environment, right to food, and many others that are implicated in these technologies. Geoengineering, though, is under UN moratoria. In the Convention on Biological Diversity has taken 2 moratoria, one on one particular technology on marine geoengineering, on ocean fertilization, and in 2010 on all technologies except in CCS. But the CBD did this based on a precautionary approach and because of the high risk potential impacts on biodiversity that these technologies could have. And the London Convention, that is to prevent ocean dumping, and its protocol, which is legally binding, took a decision in 2013 to not allow ocean fertilization, except in very small scale, legitimate scientific research. After analyzing the proposals on solar geoengineering this year, in the beginning of this year, over 250 high-level scientists are calling for to have a binding treaty on not use of solar geoengineering. This is because of the impossibility to govern solar geoengineering, because once deployed, it cannot be retrieved, and it could have a lot of impacts, for instance, imbalance the climate change even more, and also produce significant change on rain and droughts in other parts of the world. It could even affect up to 2 billion people, the sources of livelihood for 2 billion people, the sources of water and food for those people, particularly in Asia and Africa. So that's why the scientists are calling for this no-use agreement. So in relation to the issue that this webinar is focused, we really need that to somewhat meet environmental rights, human rights, environmental justice. We need to address the causes of climate change, not trying to impose these very high-tech technologies that are not going to the roots. And we have the IPCC in its most recent report, like this month, they confirm this, that 10% of the population with highest consumption costs 45% of the greenhouse gases. So we have to address this kind of lifestyle injustices that are imposing climate change onto the rest of the world. So manipulation of Earth systems will increase violations of environmental rights, of human rights, of environmental justice. So what we need is to respect rights and honor precaution and precautionary approach, which is one of the things that was enshrined in some way, like Professor Magraw was explaining, even from 72 and later. And also honor the moratoriums, the decisions in Convention on Biological Diversity and London Convention. And we need to recognize that these are not going to solve climate change, but we have a range of alternatives to stop emissions soon and to stop climate change, because those alternatives exist and can be developed and scaled up. They are environmentally sound, socially just, they are proven and affordable. And we have those on food systems, on food production, on energy, on the way of building, on urbanizations, on public transport. We need to change a lot about lifestyles and consumption and others. And this is the kind of things that could really prevent climate change to proceed. There are a series of organizations that you can go to get more information about the technologies and about the consequences of this. And there is a large international civil society organization, the Hands of Mother Earth campaign, which is based on a manifesto that you can also call that handsofmotherearth.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for your passionate speech about the dangers and the risks of geoengineering and all other kind of tech fixes that people invent to save our world. But as you also say, that's not always the best solution. If not, it's even making things worse. So the next speaker in this panel is Diane. So I would like to go on with her. You can, you're already there on the camera. So please, you have the floor, and around 5 minutes, if it's possible. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. I just want to say thank you first, perhaps to almost take a deep breath. I really struggled with what to say today, because I feel that at this point, it is very important for us to finish our presentations with hope and what we are, and there is hope embedded in there, but it is so overwhelming that it is also very hard to hold on to and exemplify that hope. The second thing I would ask people to do is to not think of our interventions and our presentations as separate, but to truly think of them as a continuum. When Daniel was speaking, when Sylvia was speaking, and when Lynn was speaking, each person was saying something that is part of what I could say in this presentation, which I won't say narrowly, but specifically was hopeful that I would focus on environmental justice, because it has been distilled as a separate issue, not a separate issue, but how we address it. Now, one other thing I have to say is, in 1972, when there was the Stockholm meeting, I was an undergraduate student. I had an internship at the then brand new Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. And that summer, I was with 4 other interns assigned to the director's office, William Ruckelshaus, who passed away about 18 months ago. And we actually prepared the briefs for the US delegation. So in a very real, tangible sense, this Stockholm process has literally been at the core of my career on all these issues. And I've been part of many organizations. I appreciate Charles narrowing down the bio, but I will add that I'm currently, again, the chair of the board at CL, the Center for International Environmental Law, and several others. And that the point is just to say, it has been the, I want to say the courage and the persistence of civil society groups. And while it has been said lightly a couple of times, I spent many, many years with WEDO, the Women's Environment and Development Organization. I bring that up not to promote any organization, but in 1972, there would not have been as many women as part of this presentation and the voices who are addressing this. I remember I was almost always the only female in the room, and as a 19-year-old, incredibly junior in the beginning. So all of this has been a very evolutionary process. And when we talk about climate change being clearly our biggest challenge, I want us to say, though, why that's the case. It's because we as humans have failed to live sustainably on Earth. Therefore, we have climate change. When as Sylvia was saying, when the technological and the geoengineering proposals are advanced, they're not done so in the context of why are we here? It's sort of like, well, as if to say it's just another, quote, advanced in an industrialized world. We have to, and I think this is fundamental to environmental justice, and I really appreciate the way Lynn addressed some of this. We have to realize we have to put a linguistic change line. We've had patriarchal and vertical structures. We need horizontal structures that are continuums. We need to understand and use in our language articulations that show the relationships. Yes, eco services. I thank you so much. I thank Dan for so many things, because we have done things together over, I think, 30 years. But maybe the best way for me to say it is, we've spent the last 50 years very, very intensely, I'm not sure it was effective, intensely politicizing the environment. And what we should have been doing was environmentalizing the political process. Now, that could be tricky in that we now make environmental decisions subject to calculations, to cost analyses. Well, yes, we're going to do those, but a vote up and down on this versus that, when you were talking about a natural system on which all life depends, is not an appropriate way in which to structure that. So that's what I mean when I say we have to really address as well language and how we frame. I see Cyril, a colleague of mine for many years, commenting on this. So I know I only have a few minutes. I want to just make a couple of other points. I really firmly believe that the 21st century is going to be the justice century. It should be, but it must be, because we cannot continue to have such fundamental levels of disparate and injustice between people, between generations, between nations, between different parts of the natural world and resources. Now, also, we have to acknowledge we have been on a very, very slow arc. I mean, Dan did a lot of work with the Magna Carta and the commemoration of that. But if we look at how we have over the last 2,000 years, roughly, as humans, looked at our global negotiating instruments, you have the Magna Carta, it wasn't until 1948 that we really got a mostly agreed upon articulation of human rights as being part of this calculation period. Then you had Olof Palme, who in 1972 was doing the Stockholm meeting. And as I said, that was part of my career. This was the proceedings from the 2002 30-year anniversary of the Stockholm meeting. I spoke there on behalf of industry, which was interesting for a number of people. And I went back and reread what I said. Quite honestly, everything that I said then still needs to be said, still needs to be addressed. And I went back and read all of the Earth Summit preparatory pieces the status quo, employing vast amounts of money, tremendous amounts of intellectual and political effort in keeping things going as they were for the set of people who have perhaps disproportionately benefited from those, and to the exclusion and to the detriment and the unfair and unjust exposures for other sectors. Now, I want to close. Well, I'm supposed to close anyway. I say often people use the metaphor, we're moving the pieces around on the chessboard, but I offer that the chessboard itself is morphing at that time. And there is an understood and justified intolerance of continuing at these levels of injustice. If you've never read it, no one else has mentioned it so far, and with several others, and I think particularly of Wangari Maathai, who couldn't always travel, I worked on the language of the Earth Charter. We are far too slowly, but we are articulating and understanding and maturing as a species on Earth that we must do things fundamentally differently. And the cost benefit analysis and weighing things and money being the arbiter of that is not sufficient to address the soul, the impact, and what needs to be done to make the decisions for us. I hope instead of leaving you with more burden, I will leave my intervention with some aspects of hope, because if we have the courage, as Maya Angelou used to say, you can't do anything consistently or well without the employing of courage. If we will employ the courage to make the decisions that we need and must make, then I have hope that we as a human species will be able to, in time, even though the clock is ticking, address what needs to be addressed. Because otherwise, no, won't say an otherwise. There is no otherwise. We must have hope. We must do this. We must make the tools and the inputs that we have made and presented today and others have presented, and hold those up and demand that states, which are no longer justifiably the sole arbiters of the decisions, but all of the sectors of society, culture. We didn't even talk about the arts. I mean, who could in 2 hours? But I just wanted to offer, there's so much that has been put forward. Remember, this is the justice century. We cannot continue with levels of injustice that have happened in terms of people. I see Leida back, so I know I must be over time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your understanding, and thank you very much for your passionate presentation, because I think it's indeed very important that we show indeed the courage, and that we also show that courage, and that also the political leaders have that courage to change things that goes against the vested interests, etc., etc. And I think it was also very well that you said that we are indeed all, or you are indeed all, very complementary in the in your interventions. So that's why it makes this webinar, I hope, interesting for everybody. So I will now like to give the floor to Bruce Myers, who is going to give us some insights on the human relations to nature. Bruce, are you there? Because I don't see you. So you can open your camera and your mic.
Okay, I should be here. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're there. Yes, so
Okay.
please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be a part of this webinar and part of this panel that Dan Magraw has assembled. And I'd like to present just a few ideas which I hope will challenge your thinking and maybe stimulate some discussion later. And first begin with just a couple of additional historical tidbits related to the time in which the Stockholm Conference took place. In 1968, actually, UNESCO hosted what it called the Biosphere Conference, at which the term biosphere was first used in international deliberations. And that concept was used to argue that humans and all other species are part of an independent ecological system that's global in scale, and that the well-being of humans and of all non-human species can't really be separated. And it was at that Biosphere Conference in 1968 that the idea to develop an international declaration on the human environment at the Stockholm Conference was first proposed. Now, the biosphere concept is a cutting-edge ecological concept, but it has also been from its very beginning a radical geopolitical and economic concept. And interestingly, for the times that we're in, it was first described and promoted by a Ukrainian biogeochemist named Vladimir Vernadsky in a 1926 book with the title of The Biosphere, which at the time was seen to be a reaction against the trend toward nationalism and fascism, really, in Europe in the 1920s. Now, as Dan Magraw described in his presentation, the well-being and even the long-term survival of our species are threatened by some of the things that people are doing. Destroying biodiversity in many places, changing the climate, toxifying the environment of the earth. And a root cause of that crisis that defines the Anthropocene is really, I think, a human supremacist worldview that dominates, and it's used to justify, really, the current global economic and geopolitical system. Now, worldviews, that is, I guess you would say how humans think about their place in nature, affect how we behave as individuals, collectively, and institutionally. And so those worldviews underpin the things that we're doing now toward the planet or within the global ecosystem, within the biosphere. In 1972, the same year of the Stockholm Conference, a Norwegian philosopher, Arne Næss, came up with an idea called deep ecology. And he said that, that biospheric egalitarianism is really going to be needed ultimately to resolve this human nature impasse, crisis, just to stop humans from treating nature just as a resource. And I agree with that. I think it's still true. Human supremacism leads ultimately to the overexploitation of resources, to overconsumption, to overpopulation, and really, I think, to both structural and overt violence at all scales, from local to global. Such a worldview creates global societies and economies that enable and maybe even inevitably lead to economic inequality, racism, violence, and the violation of human rights. Now, traditional indigenous cultures usually evolved technologies and economies and worldviews that were adapted to and also sustainable within the ecosystems of their particular bioregion. The Western human supremacist worldview colonized and destroyed many of those ecologically adapted cultures. But fortunately, in many places, they still survive, or nuclei of their worldviews still exist, and they can be revitalized and restored. And ecocentric worldviews, as Arne Naess was thinking, I believe, can also be derived from principles of ecological science. Now, the first of the 26 principles of the 1972 Stockholm Declaration, which Dan put on a slide in his presentation, concerned human rights. Human rights. Most of the other Stockholm principles, as I read them, of course, trying to give people a break for that time 50 years ago and the thinking at the time, are human-centered in many ways. And I think a future challenge for the international community, for environmental governance, is to develop language or to extend the Stockholm principles using language that reflects this idea of biospheric egalitarianism, or an ecocentric rather than a human-centered worldview. So if someone could put up a slide, please, which has been created, I think, to reflect perhaps a revision of the language of that principle 1 from Stockholm, to say something like, the rights of all living beings must be respected, protected, and promoted. Non-human species must not be treated as of lesser or only instrumental value compared to humans. And the ecosystems of the biosphere must not be colonized and exploited as resources, nor conceived of as a value only for the human species. It may be interesting to consider whether the notion of ecosystem services, which indeed is very important, can be rephrased such that those ecosystem functions are not seen as a value only as services to people. And I like the idea that was mentioned about a normative cascade, because worldviews include both a normative and an existential component. So if we could have a normative cascade that would somehow lead toward a non-human supremacist and ecocentric worldview, that would provide me, and I think the rest of us, with a lot of hope. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bayas, for your intervention as well. I think it's indeed very important that we kind of revisit maybe principle 1. Also, we are living in different times, so sometimes it's good to kind of rethink the things that we agreed upon before. In the whole discussion we had, I mean, the 4 interventions we had, and I would like to ask the other speakers also to turn on their camera so that we are, again, the panel on the screen. I mean, in the several interventions, I think one of the things that came out, or many things that came out, is that the precautionary principle is not always respected. We are having a lot of vested interests that are blocking environmental governance and law. There are a lot of power relations also, because there is a lot of focus on technical solutions, a lot of tech fixes that are even seen and acting as false solutions. So the consequences are even worse than the problem they have to solve. But we're also dealing, and that's what I hear in a lot of negotiations that I'm doing as well at the UN level, is that, let's say, the right to development, and then there is indeed no definition on what development is often seen as something more important than the right to a healthy environment. And that, I think, is something that is very dangerous, because everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people, and especially in this kind of negotiations, we see that that development is key, is core, because we can't not leave someone behind, etc., etc. This is the discussion that even at UNEP you can hear, and that always environment is something which is undermined by this social and development policies. But I also see, and that's what I would like to have your answer on, is that in a lot of countries, youth, but not only youth groups, also environmental groups, are using regulation, law, legal frameworks as then maybe the solution, because governments are not doing the things that they should do, or not good enough, not with the leadership that we ask them to have. So that's a lot of groups, as also now just in Belgium and Holland, but also in Canada, they go to court. I mean, they put the governments in court. So they have a lot of hope towards law, I mean, environmental law, that they at least hope that will then solve, or at least stop that environmental destruction. Do you see that?
Can I just say environmental? I'm only, you said environmental,
yes,
but environmental tyranny. I think that's what we've all been saying. There's a set of values of what is more important. You're making the very point in terms of development, but we've got to redefine what constitutes development. We've got to redefine. Okay.
Absolutely. No, absolutely,
so
because because I also know that a lot of environmental defenders are killed with the arguments that they are against development, so that they are blocking the development. So indeed, I mean, but it's just a pity, I think, after so many years, that we still see that polarization, or you're for the environment or you're for development, and we still cannot really practice what we already tried to do, or at least define in not in 72 but in 92 on sustainable development. But still, development is the core, let's say, for a lot of at least for a lot of member states. So how do you see, because you're all related to environmental law, how do you see that environmental law and human rights can indeed be the game changer in this whole discussion? Someone wants to take the floor. I mean, we just, the four of us, I mean, the four of you, the five of us, you can just start talking. You don't need to ask for the floor. Someone wants to react on what I just said.
Well, I can put some ideas.
Yeah, no, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
That's why you're here.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it was really interesting presentations from everybody. I want to touch what you put on the table, Leida, about, you know, what really the Stockholm conference in 72 and then in Rio put on the table is just that we can have some kind of, you know, development and environment together and respect human rights. And that is what was kind of the core, the spirit of this. And for instance, when we're speaking on climate change, I mentioned this very rapidly, that, and you think that the IPCC, which is the International Panel of Experts on Climate Change, and they are doing a really big new evaluation about climate change. But a new thing is that they have started to see that consumption and lifestyle are a very big part of this. So
absolutely.
I mentioned this about that, you know, this is their figure. It's not like an organization or an institution. Is this panel figure about that 45% of the gases are caused by 10%. And when I take this, is that the issue is that when we speak about development, we think that that will, derail the whole world, when in reality, what happens is that the first thing we really need to do is to question this very high consumption style. According to IPCC, they say that that will reduce gases from 40 to 70%, until 2050. So this is one thing. The other thing is that it's true, like you are saying, and I think it's very important to remind us all the time that for governments everywhere, and particularly in the global south, they do see development in the same vein as the development, that many of the countries of the north has taken, and that is not what most of the population in those countries want. Like I can say that we have a lot of other alternatives, and we have a lot of alternatives in production, in consumption, in thinking different ways. That yes, we need to address the basic needs of the world. But what happened since 72 until now is that we have not only an hugely growing environmental problems, like climate crisis, biodiversity, toxification, contamination, all that. We also have an incredibly growing inequity. We have much more inequity than we have ever. So these are issues that must be addressed together without falling in the trap that development is what has been done until now. We have this brilliant opportunity to think about a completely different way of development if we can also incorporate it with equity. Thank you.
Thank you. I see that Daniel raised his hand, and he was also asked, and we were already short on time. He was also promising us that he would give some recommendations also on this topic on human rights and environmental justice. But you first can react on what the discussion is about, Daniel.
Right. Well, I think law plays a big role without any question. But in addition, what you were saying about development, the concepts, the ideas play a big role. It's true in 1992, we adopted sustainable development. It wasn't until 1996 where we actually got a globally agreed statement that environmental protection, social development, and economic development are mutually interdependent parts of sustainable development, and that it is the framework for improving the quality of life. Getting that language, I can tell you, was a terrible, terrible fight. It took me 2 weeks to get that in Copenhagen, 1995. It was the last thing that was decided in that. At the very end, the head of G77 would not shake my hand. He was so angry at that language because the technocrats in particular, this goes back to what Sylvia was saying, they don't want that. They want sustained economic growth. That's their concept. It's the old trickle down, et cetera. And what I found is the closer one gets to the head of state, the more they say, well, of course we need to think about those things. That's how I stay in power. I can't just do growth. I have to think about social issues. Not that they do it perfectly, but anyway, it's a very important thing, and it's a continual battle. And again, it's the technocrats that are the worst, in my experience. A couple other points, going back to Sylvia for just a second, she's talking about a techno fix. If you go back to the Brundtland Commission report, one of the main points of that report is that technology alone will not save us. There are certain things we have to protect nature to a certain degree. We don't have the knowledge, et cetera, and that's very important. What Bruce was saying about the Biosphere Conference, I guess I need to add a new slide to my presentation, among other things. I appreciate that idea. Someone talked about cost-benefit analysis. I don't know how, I'm very skeptical about that to begin with. But how does one do that in the time of all these commitments to go to net carbon zero? That's going to be a non-marginal change, trying to predict those costs, trying to predict the
but Dan, I brought it up not as a recommendation, but that it has. Okay, I just want to make it clear. Okay,
I understand that, but what I'm saying is it's more dubious now than ever because countries are saying we're going to net zero carbon. Well, That's not
We don't even know what that
how do you
means yet.
predict that in terms of a cost benefit situation? And then back to Bruce for just a second. I'm not, one of the major principles besides principle 1 of the Stockholm Declaration is principle 21 that holds that countries are responsible for transboundary harm to the environment. It doesn't say to human health, doesn't mention humans. So I'm not sure that one actually falls into the category you were talking about. It on its face, it's not human-centric, I feel. But in any event, it's very interesting. Your comments are terrific. All of those comments, I want to thank all of you. Okay, so do you want me to try to give some recommendations here?
Yes, I think it's good. Because now, I just one thing that I'm curious about, because you're all talking about what is going over the limits. Let's say, so I think that the planetary boundaries are very important there. So we have to have a development, whoever it looks like, at least within those planetary boundaries. For that, we need science to know what are those planetary boundaries and where we are going over those boundaries. And then I think you need regulation, law, and enforcement of that to really stop that passing those planetary boundaries. So, and then I think it's indeed good that that in the UNEA 5.2 there was also the decision made that we will have a new science policy platform on the toxification of the planet, which also includes a lot of things. Is that very hopeful? And how do you see that? Is it something that we really should follow intensively and work on, Daniel? But maybe that's in one of your recommendations. I don't know.
It wasn't, but to answer that, yeah, I think it could be. The devil's in the details, needless to say. And as Lee was saying, nature keeps rearranging all of this, and so does technology, as Sylvia was pointing out. And so that science platform is going to have to keep watching, and it's going to have to be adequately funded and have the right people on it. Those are details that are really critical, but I think it is an important thing. Absolutely. So what I'll try to do here, Lee made a lot of recommendations in her presentation, which are not just hers, of course. They're from the different essayists or Imagineers, as Lee calls them. So I won't repeat all that. I'll try to distill some of them. So let me just go ahead. First, in terms of the UN General Assembly, it should recognize the right to a healthy environment in as strong a manner as is possible. For intergovernmental organizations generally, they should mainstream the right to a healthy environment and raise awareness about it, but at the same time, to keep in mind that we really do need to stop this human supremacism, as Bruce called it, and to work on what that really means. Financial institutions of all types, they need to institute effective citizen-based accountability, and that includes sovereign wealth funds all the way down to private banks. In terms of UNEP, it needs to strengthen its catalytic role, I think. And that, of course, states control UNEP, so that I'll come back to states in a minute, but that's one thing. Another thing is they need to utilize the right to a healthy environment to create the kind of normative cascade in the broad sense we're talking about. They need to strengthen the work on the environmental rule of law, which has implications for other parts of the UN system. They need to work on the compliance point that I think it was Leida mentioned earlier. They need to raise the awareness and the importance of, and then in a relationship of these different crises, they have to be viewed together, not separately. So UNDP, different part of the UN, it needs to work more effectively with UNEP, particularly on questions of the environmental rule of law, the right to a healthy environment, etc., including by prioritizing that in their country offices or its country offices, which is very important. UNICEF has to strengthen its programs about engaging children. We need children to be engaged now, not going out to protest, but just to think about why the environment is important to them. And what are the risks to it, and being creative, doing art, doing music, doing whatever. We need to get them involved because they're the future, and we need to get them to be in the practice of being involved. For World Health Organization, we haven't mentioned the pandemic really, but we need to strengthen its capacities to anticipate pandemics and to deal with them. Some of those are environment in the pure sense related, some are not, but it all fits together. States, they have to cooperate and support all of the things I mentioned, including by providing increased funding. Resources are needed. They need to deal with threats to environmental human rights defenders, as we described. They need to regulate information and communication technology adequately, because all these rights, I talked to a former general counsel of the National Security Agency in the United States last night, and he said, we're all screwed. The internet has screwed human rights. Was his analysis. And he's not an environmentalist, this guy. He's just, but Lee went through the different threats. Privacy is essentially gone for us. For example, the right to privacy and the right to freedom of opinion is really compromised because of this advertising-based business model. We went through those, but we need to monitor and regulate the ESG, this environmental, social, and governance promises and programs. A lot of greenwashing is happening, and governments need to monitor. They need to watch that. It's a securities issue, if nothing else, a fairness of advertising issue, but it matters to all of us. And the net zero carbon are the same way. We need to regulate business much more strongly and make it clear that they have human rights and environmental obligations that are not just shoulds, not just hortatory, but actually mandatory. And then we should reinvigorate efforts, or maybe start efforts, to achieve environmental justice around the world. Now, civil society essentially should robustly support all of that. I can't be much more specific, but all aspects of civil society, and utilizing a rights-based approach can help, but at the same time, they have to recalibrate and they have to think about nature as a whole. That may be tricky for a lot of them, but that's what's necessary. So,
thank you.
There you are.
Thank you. I think indeed civil society should work, because it was also mentioned in the earlier webinars that I think they should also work. I know they already work a lot, but maybe also work more on the instruments that we have, which is on the governance and human rights approach instruments, and not only topic by topic, which is absolutely necessary as well. But I think having the agreements and having the promises implemented and law enforced is indeed also very, very important. And there, I think a lot of civil society organizations are still quite weak. I think that should be stronger. If we ask governments to be stronger on environmental policies and environmental law, then I think we also should be stronger in following those this as well. But yeah, we are running out of time. I would really like to thank you, Daniel, and all the other panelists. I think that was really amazing to having you all here. And I hand over to Charles for the last few messages, and then we can close this webinar. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Leida. Please, everyone, stick with us for just another couple of minutes. We do actually have, if you would like, Leida, for each of our panelists, especially those who haven't spoken, to have one last word, if they wish. If not, that we can move on with closing statements.
I'd just like to thank everyone. Very interesting and important ideas.
Is there anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, I find it's interesting. Someone mentioned Aldo Leopold in the chat, was my next door neighbor, his younger brother, and one of my husband's patients, ironically. But we have had the voices of wisdom from so many different cultures, from indigenous voices, from women's voices, from children's voices. What we have not done, and I'm only going to make one more plea for courage, we have not listened to, we have not implemented. We need to discover, yes, but we need to use what we already know, and especially what we know internally. This is and must be the justice century. I'll close with that.
I would like to chime in too and add to the list of international organizations that should be contributing to what we need to do here, mention UNESCO, because as the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO should be able to bring together a lot of these facets of things that need to be done. And it's UNESCO that has the Men in the Biosphere program, which has this world network of biosphere reserves. There are now more than 700 in something like 133 countries. 22 are transboundary, including one that includes Belarus, Ukraine, and Poland. And I think these are supposed to be platforms, sites, laboratories, models for potentially making some progress in evolving new worldviews and in healing the human nature relationship. So UNESCO should be important and should be encouraged to do more and assisted to do more.
Thank you, Bruce. Sylvia, Lee, would either one of you like to say anything? Okay, well, with that, let's have closing comments from me. Many thanks to all of you for joining us today, in particular our audience, and to the civil society unit at the United Nations Environment Program and the government of Sweden for their cooperation and support. And especially a big thanks to Daniel, Leida, Sylvia, Bruce, Diane, and Lee for delivering today's rich, unique content and the depth of not only the information that you've shared with us and your experience, firsthand experience with being at various events throughout the world, but your commitment and compassion. That's greatly appreciated and will lend so much to this, what I think is an excellent session. Now, as mentioned earlier, the webinar has been recorded. In that recording, the PowerPoint presentations and the chat content will be sent to you by way of an automated email from the Zoom platform tomorrow. And that will include a link to the Towards Stockholm+50 events webpage, where you'll be able to view the video and download the other documents. And please do join us for the remaining Towards Stockholm+50 webinars. As seen on your screen, the next one is this coming Tuesday, the 3rd of May. The others, as you can see, one's been postponed, changed to the 12th. The other one we're still waiting for a date on. So we do hope you'll join us and we'll remind you. And finally, a short survey will pop up when the webinar ends. I'd ask that you please take a couple of moments to complete that. In the meantime, thank you so very much. And a goodbye from me. And thank you to Leida in particular for moderating so fantastically, as you always do. And thank you all, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Onward.